All right. So last week and this week we started this new kind of turn in the story of David and Jonathan, and we are looking at this friendship, this godly friendship between David and Jonathan. And there's really some simple messages here, some simple lessons, but I think in some ways they're kind of profound. And I didn't want to miss these important lessons. You know, friendship is really one of the greatest gifts from God, I believe. A good friend is one you can call on when you need to bury a body. Remember that from last week? You'll know you have a good friend. You know, some of you may have lifelong friends, and that's really a gift too, isn't it? To have a friend is one thing, but to have a lifelong friend that sticks with you through all the ups and downs of life, it's just really a blessing. I have friends that I've had for a lifetime. One of them, I started to tell you the story last week, and I never really finished it. I had a buddy, Jim, growing up. And when I was in 8th grade, Jim moved away to Wisconsin. And his family went to work at a camp, a Christian camp up in Wisconsin. And so I really missed him. And so in high school, I would try to get up there anytime I could. And on one of these trips up to Wisconsin, he and I ended up in his car riding around in the back roads in southern Wisconsin. And there was a hill we used to like to drive up and down. It was called Roller Coaster Hill. And this hill was really steep. It would go up and down, up and down. It was just a kind of a country road. And of course, we were going way too fast. And it was dark out. And came to the top of a hill, and there was a car coming the other way, right in front of us. And they were doing the same thing. And to this day, I'm not sure how he got that car to swerve over to the right. We must have just missed them by a hair. But we lived to tell about it, and that was probably the last time we drove fast going up and down that road. And Jim and I have lots of stories to tell about our times together growing up and in high school. Maybe you have a friend like that you've had for a long time, maybe done some crazy things with, and you just have great memories. Friendship really is a gift from God. And a good friend is really something that God uses to bless us with. A friend is one who will stick up for you when you're in trouble, right? And a friend will sometimes even put their life on the line, as we're going to see in the story today from 1 Samuel 20. There are two verses I want to mention. I put them up last week. They're about friendship from Proverbs 18:24. One who has unreliable friends soon comes to ruin, but there is a friend who sticks closer than a brother. And then Proverbs 17:17. A friend loves at all times, and a brother is born for a time of adversity. I'm sure as I'm speaking, you're thinking of some friendships that you've had that have been with you through some adversity and who have stuck with you through some difficult times. That's really what a friend does. A friend loves at all times, even when times are difficult or when we do something wrong, a friend will be by our side. Friendship really is one of the greatest gifts from God that we experience in this life. And godly friendship is a double blessing. Today we're going to look at the godly friendship between David and Jonathan. Remember last week we kind of left off with David escaping out the window of his home, let down by his wife Michal, and off he runs to Ramah to go find Samuel and kind of, get out of Dodge while the heat is on with Saul. And we sort of left David on the run. And today's story, David's coming back now and he's meeting up with Jonathan. And we're going to break down this story. It breaks down really nicely into a 4-part story of David's friendship with Jonathan. The first part is David's plan to help Jonathan know about Saul's intentions. So Jonathan didn't really know all that Saul had done to David. We don't know why, but Jonathan was unaware that Saul had tried to kill David and sent these men after him. So we're going to pick up the story in 20, and we're going to read 1 through 7. Then David fled from Naioth in Ramah and came and said to Jonathan, "What have I done? What is my iniquity? And what is my sin before your father, that he is seeking my life?" And he said to him, "Far from it, you shall not die. Behold, my father does nothing either great or small without disclosing it to me. So why should my father hide this thing from me? It is not so." Yet David vowed again, saying, "Your father knows well that I have found favor in your sight, and he has said, 'Do not let Jonathan know this, lest he be grieved. But truly, as the Lord lives, and as your soul lives, there is hardly a step between me and death.'" Then Jonathan said to David, "Whatever you say, I will do for you." So David said to Jonathan, "Behold, tomorrow is the new moon, and I ought to sit down to eat with the king. But let me go, that I may hide myself in the field until the third evening. If your father misses me at all, then say, 'David earnestly asked leave of me to run to Bethlehem, his city, because it is the yearly sacrifice there for the whole family.' If he says, 'It is good,' your servant shall be safe. But if he is very angry, know that he has decided on evil." So David's trying to sort of inform Jonathan of how bad things are between him and Saul. And this is David's plan to sort of help Jonathan come to grips with what's really going on. So apparently, Jonathan wasn't aware of all that happened in chapter 19, the story we told last week of David going out the window, going on the run, of Saul sending these men to stake out David's house and watch for him. Jonathan wasn't aware of these events. And in this discussion between David and Jonathan, it's not that Jonathan thinks David is lying so much, but he's having a hard time coming to grips with all that David has told him. And he's not really fully believing it. And you kind of get the impression that Jonathan thought Saul would inform him of any changes, or if Saul was doing something big like trying to kill David, Jonathan was expecting that Saul would have informed him. And I think there's kind of a lesson here for all of us. Don't expect a lot of communication for someone who is driven by their anger. Don't expect someone to broadcast their moves to you when they're filled with such rage and anger. And don't expect a madman to be reasonable. Jonathan was trying to believe the best here, and Saul simply was not very reasonable, driven by his anger. And David asks these pointed questions. What have I done? What is my sin before him? Sometimes when we're in a situation where someone is persecuting us, we might be tempted to ask the same questions. What have I done? What did I do to make this person so mad? It's a natural question to be asked. Maybe you've asked these questions when you've been in different situations yourself. I love David's description of his situation. There's hardly a step between me and death. What a great description. And David sort of voicing the sentiments of many people through history who have been in times of trouble. There's hardly a step between me and death. So in this part of 1 Samuel, we've kind of come to the point where we're sort of turning the page, and David now realizes that he needs to flee the court and run from Saul's presence. This is the beginning of David the fugitive. David on the run. All right, let's look at part two. Part two, David and Jonathan's mutual covenant. This is really the central part of chapter 20, this covenant friendship between these two men. Jonathan and David really had a beautiful friendship. And this theme is going to run through the next couple of chapters. It comes out here in verses 8 and 9. "Therefore, deal kindly with your servant." This is David speaking to Jonathan. "For you have brought your servant into a covenant of the Lord with you. But if there is iniquity in me, put me to death yourself. For why then should you bring me to your father? And Jonathan said, Far be it from you, for if I should indeed learn that evil has been decided by my father to come upon you, then would I not tell you about it? So David says, deal kindly with me. You know, if I've done something wrong, just go ahead and kill me yourself, is what he's telling Jonathan. David was sure that he had done nothing to deserve the treatment that Saul had put him under. You know, there's a lot of humility in David through this chapter. David calling himself Jonathan's servant a couple of times in this passage. Really, both men are exhibiting a lot of humility. Jonathan, you know, look at it from Jonathan's vantage point. From a human perspective, Jonathan really should have been in the line of kingship after Saul because Jonathan was his son. And later on, we're going to see how Saul sort of chides Jonathan, telling him, you know, if you don't watch it, you're going to lose the kingship. You're going to lose your place in the lineup. And so both of these guys are being humble. Jonathan wasn't trying to take the throne for his family. He was submitting himself to God. And I've been thinking about how humility really has an important role in friendship. That humility is really a great asset in a friendship. Where humility is lacking, friendships are strained. And you know this because you've had this experience. Where humility is lacking in any relationship will be difficult. Humility is vital to strong friendship. And this is really at the core of their relationship with each other, along with their godliness and their faith in God. Made for a really strong friendship between these two men. Okay, on to part 3. Jonathan's plan to let David know that he knows. So Jonathan's going to give us this plan to let David know that he now agrees with him and sees things as they are. Let's pick up the story in verse 10. Then David said to Jonathan, Who will tell me if your father answers you harshly? And Jonathan said to David, Come and let's go out into the field. So both of them went out to the field. Then Jonathan said to David, The Lord, the God of Israel, be witness. When I have sounded out my father about this tomorrow, or the third day, behold, if there is a good feeling towards David, shall I not then send to you and make it known to you? So Jonathan has taken David out into the field, and he's saying, I'm going to go find out, and in 3 days I will come back and let you know the status of your relationship with my father. And so here's the plan. If it pleases my father to do you harm, may the Lord do so to Jonathan, and more also, if I do not make it known to you and send you away, that you may go in safety. And may the Lord be with you as he has been with my father. That's an important statement, and we're going to come back to that a little bit later. Let's pick up the story in verse 16. So Jonathan made a covenant with the house of David, saying, now interesting that Jonathan not only is having a covenant with David, but it's a covenant that's going to last beyond his generation. It says that he made a covenant with the house of David, saying, May the Lord require it at the hands of David's enemies. And Jonathan made David vow again because of his love for him, because he loved him as he loved his own life. Then Jonathan said to him, Tomorrow is the new moon, and you will be missed, because your seat will be empty. When you have stayed for 3 days, you shall go down quickly and come to the place where you hid yourself on that eventful day, and you shall remain by the stone Ezel. It's kind of a famous or well-known stone in that field. Nobody knows where that stone is today, but it was there, and it was kind of a landmark during that time. And I will shoot 3 arrows to your side, to the side, as though I shot at a target. And behold, I will send the lad, saying, Go find the arrows. If I specifically say to the lad, Behold, the arrows are on this side of you, get them. Then come, for there is safety for you, and no harm, as the Lord lives. But if I say to the youth, Behold, the arrows are beyond you, go, for the Lord has sent you away. As for the agreement of which you and I have spoken, behold, the Lord is between you and me forever. So David hid in the field, and when the new moon came, the king sat down to eat food. And the king sat on his seat as usual, the seat by the wall. Then Jonathan rose up, and Abner sat down by Saul's side. But David's place was empty. Let's pick it up in verse 27. And it came about on the next day, the second day of the new moon, that David's place was empty. So Saul said to Jonathan his son, Why has the son of Jesse not come to the meal, either yesterday or today? Jonathan then answered Saul, David earnestly asked leave of me to go to Bethlehem. For he said, Please let me go, since our family has a sacrifice in the city, and my brother has commanded me to attend. And now, if I have found favor in your sight, please let me go away, that I may see my brothers. For this reason, he has not come to the king's table. And then that part of the story kind of picks up down in verse 35. And this is where Jonathan actually goes out into the field and shoots the arrows. And he does shoot the arrow beyond the young lad, and which is a signal to David that he's got to go on the run. And so David gets the message. And we'll come back to the other parts in a little bit, what happened with Jonathan, with Saul, and then their parting goodbye at the end. I want to point out a couple of things in this section of the passage. Jonathan says in verse 13, May the Lord be with you as he has been with my father. So now for the first time, Jonathan is using language about his father's role as king in the past tense. Jonathan recognizes now that David would be the king. And I think this part of the story is kind of interesting because we're not really informed how Jonathan found that out, that David was anointed as king. Remember, when David was anointed as king, it was a very private ceremony with just David's family and a few other people. But now Jonathan has come to recognize that David is to be king and that it's ordained by God. And Jonathan is working in full submission to God's will in this matter. Remember that Jonathan, from a human standpoint, would have been the next in line to be king had Saul stayed in his role. But that was not to be the case. And I think there's a lesson here too for you and I. Wise saints will align themselves not with the winds of human pursuits, but with the plans of God. That's an important point in this story, and I want to repeat it. Wise Christians will align themselves not with the winds of human pursuits, but with the plans of God. We need to make sure that we're aligned with where God is headed. We need to make sure that we're in step with the Spirit and what God is doing. You know, in those days, it was commonplace for a king to kill off all their rivals when coming into power. It was sort of a way for them to secure power. You know, we've all heard about even modern-day dictators who've done the same thing. I've mentioned before about Saddam Hussein and how his first act when he became president was to kill off anybody who he suspected was working against him. It's the way of the dictator. Get rid of anybody who might try to seek power and make sure that everybody's in line with you. Now, there's a great example of this in 2 Kings 11, 1 through 3. This is a different time in Israel's history. It says, When Athaliah, the mother of Ahaziah, saw that her son was dead, she rose and destroyed all the royal offspring. But Jehosheba, the daughter of King Joram, sister of Ahaziah, took Joash, the son of Ahaziah, and stole him from among the king's sons who were being put to death, and placed him and his nurse in the bedroom. So they hid him from Athaliah, and he was not put to death. So he was hidden with her in the house of the Lord 6 years, while Athaliah was reigning over the land. So it's a great story about how Joash was hidden away so that he wouldn't be killed with all the other sons. And for 6 years, he was hidden away and kept from being killed off. It's a terrible time to be in any kind of leadership role in any country in that part of the world. I mean, you know, you're destined to die at some point. It's just a matter of when they're going to come and get you. And so that was sort of the environment that God had sort of altered when he brought in the theocracy of Israel and the rule under his appointed kings. I've been thinking about this whole idea of getting rid of anyone who may be a threat to your power. Those who have been given authority by God need not resort to such tactics, right? If God has put you in a place of authority, you don't need to resort to such terrible things as getting rid of the people who God has been using or who God has placed in their role. So we have this situation where Saul has planned a meal to recognize the new moon with a feast. This was something they did. Every time there was a new moon, there would be sacrifices and a meal. And here Saul has planned this religious meal. It was sort of a time of sacrifice and celebrating the new moon. And Saul has done what any leader of a theocracy should do and put this meal together, and David wasn't there. Been thinking about Saul as the organizer of this meal. It's amazing that the guy who is planning a religious function is also planning a murder. The guy who is supposed to be doing something godly on the side is planning to murder the person that God had placed in that role. So another lesson for you and I. Just because someone is a planner of religious functions doesn't mean they have godly intentions. Something that's worth thought for you and I. And then the passage says in verse 25 that Saul took his seat by the wall. I'm reminded of the Western novel called Shane. Has anybody read this book called Shane? I was required reading in 7th grade when I was a kid, and I love this book. It's a Western novel. And Shane was this character, sort of this seedy, wiry guy, and he would always sit with his back to the wall. It's because he was always in trouble, and he wanted to see the door. And I kind of think that Saul is in that same situation. He's living in fear. And he's sitting, it says, his place with his back to the wall. When you sit with your back to the wall, it's because you're afraid of who might come through the door. And that's just the way it is for Saul at this time in his life, because he is no longer the anointed leader, and God has chosen a new leader. Well, then we come to this emotional farewell. You know, David, after saying goodbye, and this happens down in the very end, verses 39 through 42. I'll read 42 just as so we can kind of get the idea of what's happening here. It says, "And Jonathan said to David, 'Go to me, go in safety.'" Now this is David and Jonathan speaking. Jonathan has sent the young lad back to the city, and David and Jonathan are here alone in the field saying goodbye. David knows he needs to go on the run. Jonathan says, "Go in safety, inasmuch as we have sworn to each other in the name of the Lord, saying, 'The Lord will be between you and me, and between my descendants and your descendants forever.'" That sounds like a long-term parting, doesn't it? Sounds like they know they're going to be apart for some time. Then he rose and departed, while Jonathan went into the city. There's an interesting literary device that appears in this particular verse. I can hardly pronounce the word, but I think it's aposiopesis. And basically, that means when a sentence is left purposely incomplete. It's when the writer leaves a sentence, or the speaker leaves a sentence purposely incomplete because there's such strong emotion. And maybe you've experienced this. You get word that someone has passed away, or you get that phone call and somebody's in trouble. And when you have to let others know, you give shortened sentences. It's kind of what's happening here. There's such deep emotion between these two friends, and they're saying goodbye. And what do you say when you have to say goodbye to such an important and deep friendship? Well, then we come to part 4. Part 4 really falls in the middle of the section. I'm going to read verses 30 through 34. This is the price of Jonathan's righteous act. Sometimes when you do the right thing, there's a price to be paid. And Jonathan paid a dear price for speaking up on behalf of David. We will pick up the story in 30 and 34. Then Saul's anger burned against Jonathan. This is Jonathan at the meal with his father and the various political leaders. His anger burned against Jonathan, and he said to him, "You son of a perverse, rebellious woman." Sounds funny to read that in English. I'll have something to say about that in a minute. "Do I not know that you are choosing the son of Jesse to your own shame and to the shame of your mother's nakedness? For as long as the son of Jesse lives on the earth, neither you nor your kingdom will be established. Therefore now send and bring him to me, for he must surely die." But Jonathan answered Saul, his father, and said to him, "Why should he be put to death? What has he done?" He's referring to the questions that David asked. Why should he be put to death? What has he done? Then Saul hurled his spear at him to strike him down. So Jonathan knew that his father had decided to put David to death. Then Jonathan arose from the table in fierce anger and did not eat food on the second day of the new moon, for he was grieved over David because his father had dishonored him. This is the price that Jonathan was to pay for his friendship with David, and yet Jonathan was doing what was right. He was sticking up for God's plan and sticking up for the appointed leader of Israel. I don't want you to miss this strange statement Saul is making about Jonathan's mother. Why is he bringing his mother into the situation here? Well, this is actually quite a vulgar statement, and translators have really had a hard time translating what Saul is saying. It doesn't really come across well in English, and some translations actually use some pretty colorful language to describe what Saul is saying. It's really a vulgar thing that Saul is speaking to Jonathan. The extent of Saul's anger really shows his jealousy, doesn't it? This really shows how bitterly, just angry that Saul was, and just how out of control his emotions had become, that he would hurl a spear at his own son. This is kind of fascinating when you think about it, because just a little bit ago, we were talking about the fact that Saul was telling Jonathan, you better be careful that, if you don't watch it, you're not going to be in the lineup for the throne. And now he's trying to kill him. So I'm kind of confused here, Saul. What is it? Do you want Jonathan to be on the throne after you or not? Because it's kind of hard to be king when you've been murdered. But Saul is just out of control. And, maybe you've had that experience where your emotions were just so out of control and the words coming out of your mouth were not what you would have chosen had you had time to settle down and think about it. I had an experience, it wasn't really my experience, but in one of the previous churches where I served, there was one of the elders who was an executive at Enron when Enron was going under. And he would come in and describe, when we would see him, he would describe this environment in Enron. They knew the ship was sinking. And people were doing all kinds of crazy things, trying to, cover their tail and trying to save the company and all kinds of crazy things. And one of the vice presidents was sending down the line these edicts. Maybe in your job you had this experience where, one of the big bosses sends down some stupid new rule and you got to follow it. And this guy who was reportable to the vice president, I don't remember which division it was, but he was reportable to the vice president. And another one of these statements had been handed down, and this elder, coming into an elder meeting one Monday night, was telling this story, and it just had happened at work that day, that this executive got so fed up at another rule being handed down that he started carving out an email. He starts writing an email to that vice president. And he wrote in, maybe you've done this, writing an email that you never intended to send. And he wrote terrible things about the vice president's wife and his daughters, just awful, terrible, terrible things. And when he went to delete the email, he accidentally hit send. And this man, his name was Joe, he was saying, yeah, it's kind of funny, the guy didn't even show up for work today. Imagine that. And maybe you've had that experience where you've been so emotional and so caught up in the emotions of the moment that you didn't think through the words you were saying. Saul's really mad here. He is really mad to be hurling a spear at his own son. He's out of control. And really, these are all troubles that Saul brought on himself. These are all things that Saul did to himself. If he would have just submitted to the Lord from the beginning, things would have been very different. I mentioned last week about this verse from Acts 26:14. I think I have it. Yes, it's hard to kick against the goads. This is Christ speaking to Saul, later who became the Apostle Paul, on the road to Damascus when Saul was converted. Christ was saying to him, it's hard to kick against the goads. This is really for all of us. It's hard to work against God's will. And we see this in Saul over and over. Every week we've talked about Saul. It's just terrible things because he's not in line with God's plan. And he's really brought the trouble on himself. In this passage in Acts, a goad was these sticks that the farmers or the caretakers of the animals would use to kind of prod the cattle along or the oxen along. Sharp stick, and sometimes the oxen or the cattle would kick against it. Well, who is the animal going to hurt but themselves? It's a description of the Apostle Paul, who was previously Saul, what his life was like. He'd been working against God all along. We thought about the song, I Fought the Law and the Law Won. Remember that song? Maybe if you're a little bit younger, you might remember John Mellencamp's version. When I fight authority, authority always wins. I thought of another one. This doesn't really fit here, but I'll say it anyway. I shot the sheriff, but I did not shoot the deputy. Remember that one? All these songs have to do with you're working against the law, you're going to lose. There's only one way that's going to end up. It's best that we be humble and that we submit to God's will. That's what David and Jonathan were doing. But it's exactly what Saul was not doing. I think there's a commentary here for the church in America today. I wrote an article this last month for the Last Days Beacon. It's actually on the rack already, about the church growth movement. And there's this thing that's going on, it's been going on for a long time, where people are coming up with all these crazy plans to make the church grow. If you follow these 5 steps, your church will grow. And a lot of it, to me, just seems like arrogance. that one would think they could do anything beyond what God decrees. I see a lot of this in the church in the West today. Men declaring what they are going to do to grow the church. You know, there are seminars you can go to that give you these steps to a growing church. I recall years ago going to a very large church growth conference. And in this conference, the speaker was telling how to unload staff members who were underperforming and how to fill the staff with people who were high-performing leaders. And I just remember sitting in this seminar thinking, this is kind of offensive. Because Scripture really does give us one way to grow the church. And we kind of go all around trying to do all these crazy things to make the church grow. And really, the outline's been given to us in Matthew 28, 19, and 20. I think I have it for you. You probably know this or have heard it. Therefore, go and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, and teaching them to obey everything I have commanded you. And surely I am with you always to the very end of the age. That's our job assignment. That's our job description right there. I remember when I was in high school, I had my first job at 16, and the very first thing they did when I walked into, it was a Woolco. It was the box store version of Woolworths, and it was kind of like a Kmart. And when I walked in the first day, they handed me a job description. This is what your position entails. Maybe you've been given a job description. The job description for the church is right there. That we're to grow the church by making disciples. So it seems to me that there's just a lot of arrogance in thinking that there's some man-designed way to create a move of God. Our work is to be humbler and more prayer-oriented. We're to be more dependent on the Lord as we try to reach people and share the love of Christ with them. You know, the Reformers used to speak of two churches. They spoke about the visible church and the invisible church. And they would describe the visible church as the things you see with the naked eye, the outward things. But the invisible church is represented by all the mysterious things going on behind the scenes that we usually don't see. And we know that there's a day coming when the church will be raptured to be with God forever. And at that time, there will be some who are left behind, but some who think that they are one of the sheep, and they'll find out that they're the goats. And so there's this visible church, and there's this invisible church. And we can't really see the invisible church. That's represented by the work of God. And it's not what we see. And I just see the church in the West today doing too much related to the visible church, and not enough ministry related to the invisible church. Not enough cooperating with God. I'm preaching to myself here that I feel like this is what we need for our concentration to be. To get ourselves aligned with the things that God is doing. And not get caught up in all the smoke and mirrors of what people think will grow the church. I'm kind of moved too by this negative example of Saul in hurling the spear at his son, the one who should have been king behind Saul, according to man. And Saul's just his attitude, continually seeking to do something out of his own power to retain his kingship. Everything but submitting to the Lord and working in cooperation with the Lord. And it's sort of convicting for me as I think about this. May we never think that we're the ones in charge of our own standing. May we never think that power is in our hands. The Lord is the one, we learned last week, who appoints kings. It's the Lord who puts people in their places of leadership. And I think our role is to be very humble and to be very submissive to what the Lord wants from us. How often pride brings about self-destruction. And this is a warning for us to be on guard against pride in our own lives. We've all known somebody who was given a raise or who was given a promotion at work, and all of a sudden it went to their head. You've seen this happen. May we never be like that. May we realize that God is the one who places us in our standing in life. God is the one that we need to be in submission to. There's a great verse in Romans I wanted to bring up here. Romans 13, 1 and 2. This is Paul talking about the attitude we should have related to governing authorities. Let everyone be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except that which God has established. The authorities that exist have been established by God. Consequently, whoever rebels against the authority is rebelling against what God has instituted, and those who do so will bring judgment on themselves. Now, I understand the environment that we live in today, and I think there's a context which needs to be brought into this. There are times when we are called upon as Christians to work against the authorities and to voice our opinion when it is appropriate. And we live in a country that is supposed to be democratically ruled. And so there's a place for us to speak up and to vote and to bring about change when we can. But ultimately, what this verse is saying is that God is the one who puts rulers in their place. And there is a sense where we need to recognize that. And we need to be submissive to what he's doing. And it goes for business. It goes for the church. It goes for your neighborhood HOA. That there are times where we need to recognize that God places people in a role, and maybe he has something that he's trying to accomplish in their lives. Jonathan was very trusting of the Lord. He was submissive to God's will. He wanted to believe that his father wasn't really intending to kill David, but eventually it came to a painful realization for Jonathan. It became obvious to him here in this section that we've been working on. And it's interesting about Jonathan that though he was born into royalty of sorts, he did not consider royalty a thing to be grasped. Kind of sounds like someone else in Scripture. And that humility is an example for us. Jonathan exhibits this incredible satisfaction in submitting to God's will. It's one of the things I'm going away with from chapter 20. And we do have a takeaway I wanted to bring before you before we leave. These are sort of the summary of what we've learned today and what we can take with us. Number one, if you're going to align yourself with a person, align yourself with the person who God is blessing. Make sure you're in line with God's plan, not just the plan of man. Make sure you align yourself with God's plan, not just the plan of man. There's a great quote by Henry Blackaby. Find out where God is working and join him. That was, if you've done the Experiencing God Bible study, this is one of the major principles in that study. Find out where God is working and join him. It's a great principle to live by. And then, of course, godly friendship is a wonderful gift. And if you have them, if you have godly friendships, I think one of the things is to be thankful and to thank God that he's put people in your life, godly friendships, people who will look out for you and who have wholesome and godly intentions for you. That's a great gift from God if you have godly friendships.